right now we're delighted to have this panel who will be speaking to us about the movement from the sanctuary to advocacy. And that's a long journey, a journey that's still going on. And we're just blessed to have each and every one of you here with us.
Thank you so much for being here, and thank you to the panelists for joining us. And we're looking forward to hearing your stories today. My name is Anthony Petro. I teach at Boston University, and I'm delighted to moderate this panel as part of the Rolling the Stone Away conference on From Sanctuary to Advocacy, thinking especially about the work that we've done in the 1980s and the 1990s. I'm joined here today going from closest to farthest from me, but only in space, not in terms of fondness. Nancy Wilson, Marianne Duddy Burke, Zachary Jones, and Aaron Swinson. Each of our panelists is going to speak for about 10 minutes, telling their stories, and then we will open it up to a broader conversation.
So good afternoon. Oh my goodness. Now let's gird our loins here and really get ready for this conversation. We can do it. We can do it. I want to first say that part of everything is our context. And I want to give honor to the context that for our movement in the 80s and 90s, but also in the 60s and 70s, it was the civil rights movement of the 60s, 50s and 60s particularly, that was our inspiration for nonviolent resistance. Without that movement, people like Bayard Rustin and so many others, we would not be here. We would not have the movement we have. And, we kind of forget to do that, and including me. And I just want to say today how indebted we are. And my story is about nonviolent resistance that occurred in the late 1980s. I was the pastor of Metropolitan Community Church of Los Angeles. I'd been in MCC through the decade of the 70s, where many of our churches were burned to the ground, where we had a pastor who was murdered. We experienced the fire in the upstairs lounge in New Orleans. We experienced tremendous violence against our churches and our movement. And as we came into the 80s, we came in with a lot of excitement and enthusiasm, thinking, well, we are making steady progress. And then AIDS descended upon us. And as a pastor of a church in an urban area in Los Angeles, I was caught between two things: the urgent pastoral needs every single day of people in the hospital, sick and dying, doing funerals, ministering to families, and on the other side, the activism piece, where we simply had to be a voice of faith, where oftentimes the churches were slow to respond or not there at all. And I remember one particular day, I had a friend, Connie Norman, who was a transgender activist extraordinaire, and she would not darken the door of a church, but she would call me up and say, Reverend Wilson, we need some collars out here, meaning clergy collars. And they were on the steps of the federal building in Los Angeles. And it was people with AIDS who were protesting for the release of DDI, a particular drug that hopefully would be a new way to slow down the AIDS epidemic. Instead, it caused pancreas problems and lots of other things and hallucinations for people. But we were so desperate. People were so desperate, and it felt like the federal government, of course, Ronald Reagan was president. It was a time of the moral majority that was coming into being. And so people felt desperate to get the word out that this was a terrible crisis, a Holocaust happening in our community. And so this particular day, we went to the federal building in downtown Los Angeles. I handed the keys to my car to a member of the church. And when I got there, Connie and others were handcuffing themselves to the federal building. And so, for the first time ever, I handcuffed myself to the federal building. And then it was just a standstill for hours and hours. And finally, the federal troops came in wearing yellow gloves. Not hazmat suits, but they were wearing yellow gloves because, people with AIDS. And so there we were. And they came up to each of us and said, if you don't leave, and of course now he's handcuffed to the building, it was hard to leave, but they came and they, cut off the handcuffs, and they then, I'd learned about nonviolent resistance doing work around Central America, and so, I'd been trained and that they drag you, but it was a long way to where the police cars were and downstairs and all of this at the federal building. And I'm sure it was a lesbian wearing the yellow gloves, a federal marshal, who came underneath me and said, "Nancy, stand up." And she pulled me up, very butch lesbian, pulled me up and said, "Stand up," and I did, and got all the way to the paddy wagons, but the paddy wagons were full. And so they put us in a police car. And so I'm handcuffed around my back. I'm a little scuffed up, handcuffed, and they kind of shove you in the back of the police car, kind of making sure your head doesn't, get hit, because I was a white person, amen, right? Okay, they put me in, and I'm handcuffed. And then my dear friend Wayne, who was a person with HIV, who was a wild man activist, and Wayne made them drag him all the way down all of those steps. And he was shouting slogans the whole way. This was his whole life. He was screaming and screaming, and he was not going to stop screaming. And they not only handcuffed him, but they cuffed his legs together. And so they're bringing him, and our police car is already full. And so they open the door, and they shove Wayne on top of me so that his face is on my feet. And his legs are up in the, window of the car. And, it was just so bizarre. And he's going, I'm sorry, Reverend Wilson, I'm sorry, And later on, he told me he was so glad, though, that his face was on my shoes and not on the bottom of the police car, and that he thought the top of my shoes was probably cleaner than the bottom of the police car, And so there we were, handcuffed and in this very strange, intimate position that we were in together. And when I think of it, and I think of him, in some ways I think of the vision of Peter hanging upside down on the cross, there he was. And so eventually they took us downtown and booked us, and we were there on 6th Street in Los Angeles, which is not a pretty place to be booked, and all of that. But and I saw Wayne a few times after that before he died. He died a year later, and we always embraced and hugged each other and thought about that amazing ride we'd had in that police car, and what it meant for us to be in the streets with people who were desperate, fighting for our lives together. And, I always felt like to do whatever I was asked to do, and to be present and to do that, because we had to put our bodies there, not just our statements, not just our letters to people. And we were one other time we were all arrested, a bunch of us, Rabbi Denise Egger and Father Malcolm Boyd, others of us, in front of the Board of Supervisors. We knelt in front of them, begging them to release money for people with AIDS in Los Angeles. And they arrested us, and the Los Angeles Times said, "People dressed as clergy today were arrested." So, how am I doing? There was something else, one more? So the last, I think, story I'll tell is that I was on the Ron Reagan Jr. show. It had about, I think it was one season, 10 or 11 shows, with Jerry Falwell in the early 90s. And Jerry Falwell, it was just, who could resist the temptation to be on with Jerry Falwell? So we were on, and he was sitting next to me, and Jerry Falwell was a very, very large man sitting next to me. And we were talking about several things. And there were about 20 people from our church in the audience and other people in the studio audience. And at one point, Jerry Falwell put his hand on my knee. Now, two things happened. Was 10 lesbians rose up, and I knew they were going to come down and kill him. So I quickly did this. And everyone in this room knows that gesture, right? And some men, right? You know that gesture. And, But I had the joy of saying at one point, apropos of nothing, I said, Jerry, you know, the reason I would want to die before you is so that when you got there, I could be on the welcome wagon in heaven to meet you. And the best thing of all was that he laughed out loud. And it was the supreme satisfaction, I think, of, in a sense, you know, that turning things around, of making the moral majority look as ridiculous as they looked then and as they still are now in what they're doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Next up is Marianne. And I don't know if that mic works. I think it does. You can take it out, too, if you want.
Okay. Does it work from here? Yeah. That's good. Okay. Really looking forward to this conversation because the 80s and 90s were such pivotal decades in certainly in the queer Catholicism movement. I think that's the time when we really sort of found our integrity and our freedom from the institution. But we'll get into that a lot later. What I've been asked to do at the beginning is to sort of tell you a story that happened in October, started in October of 1982. At that point, I was a 21-year-old person in about my 6th week at the Weston Jesuit School of Theology in Cambridge, Massachusetts, an out lesbian there, which went over really well. And I had just come to dignity after a period of about 2.5 years where I did not have Catholic community as the result of being fired from my job as the president of the Newman Group by the chaplain who confronted me about my sexuality. And when I said, yes, I was a lesbian, he said, we can't have someone like you representing Catholics on campus. And, while I never took in the condemnation personally, I was cut off from community. And so one Sunday in October of 1982, there was a big article in the Boston Sunday Globe about this community of Dignity, Boston. And my straight college friend roommate had read the paper first and said, you need to read this. This is perfect for you. And I read it and was just overwhelmed by the idea that there might be a Catholic community where I could be both lesbian and a full member of my faith. And she and I went that very afternoon, and Dignity at that point was meeting in the Arlington Street Church on the corner of the Public Garden in Boston, and we got there an hour early and sat in the grass on the Public Garden and watched people go in down these stairs, just watched person after person go in, and finally decided that it didn't look like there were any, crazy people that were dangerous crazy going in there. So we went in and slipped into a back row, as good Catholics tend to do. And then people started to sing. The Mass began, and people started to sing. And I just wept, because there was such intensity and prayerfulness in that singing. And it was clear that everyone in that room had made the choice to be there, wanted to be there. It was important to them to be there. And I felt at home. So I kept going and kept slipping into that back row of seats and kind of dashing out as soon as the Mass was over and not really getting to know too many people there. And about 3 or 4 months into this experience, one Sunday, it was in February, I think, this basement church where we met was essentially the parish hall. And we, kind of rolled in an altar and set it up in front of this little stage with a curtain behind it. And as the gospel was being read, we could hear and see boots walking behind this curtain. And after the gospel had been proclaimed, Michael Scally, who was the president of the community at that point, stood up before the homily could begin, and he said, I'm sorry to tell you that there has been a bomb threat. And the Boston police are here investigating. We've been told that there are 2 bombs planted in the building. And the police believe that this is a hoax and are encouraging us to stay, because whoever called this in is probably sitting outside watching what's happening and sort of taking delight in frightening the queers. If you need to leave, please do so, but we encourage you to stay. And I think maybe 2 people left. And I remember sitting there in this, metal folding chair next to this great big man whom I knew. It was a red-headed taxi driver who I knew as Frank, which wasn't his real name, because back then most people did not use their real names or didn't give their last names. And Frank and I kind of looked at each other and took a deep breath, and he reached over and just held me. And for the rest of the liturgy, we kind of just held each other, not knowing if we were going to make it to the final blessing. And I realized in that moment that these were people I was willing to live with and die with and experience whatever came with. And after that, it was kind of the call to join the choir and join the Women's Concerns Group, go to a national conference, and become more invested in what this community was all about.
You know that Marianne is not Baptist because she always comes in under time. Because
I'm not ordained.
Because we have a few minutes left, I'd love to hear about your experience with Dignity, and especially around the Halloween letter. If you could tell us a little about that Halloween letter and how it impacted your work with Dignity.
Yeah, I'm sure that's going to be kind of the larger discussion, but on October 31st of 1986, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which is the Vatican office, which used to be the Inquisition, who was at the time headed by Cardinal Ratzinger, who became Benedict XVI, released what was called a letter to the bishops of the world on the pastoral care of homosexual persons, which had a bunch of really horrific teachings in this letter, among them that being gay or gay and lesbian was really addressed around gay and lesbian issues, really gay issues, gay people, gay men, that being gay was an objective disorder. You were less than what God created humanity to be. And any homosexual sexual activity was intrinsically evil. It also had, and that continues to be the doctrine of the church on homosexuality. It also had lines in it like, even though their behavior persists in killing people, it was very vitriolic statements around AIDS. And the other one was that no one should be surprised if people are agitating for civil protections for behavior to which no one has any inconceivable right, that violence is what results. So sort of, blaming us for violence against us as we were seeking civil rights. It also said that groups that were not consistent with Catholic teaching on homosexuality, groups like Dignity and New Ways and any other group who didn't believe in this intrinsic evil and objective disorder stuff, could no longer meet in Catholic space. So following this document, when Dignity met immediately there began a wave of expulsions. 35 Dignity chapters were expelled from Catholic space in under a year. And when we next met together in July of 1987, Dignity USA added to our statement of position and purpose an explicit statement saying that we believed that same-sex relationships could be loving, life-giving, and life-affirming, some language like that. So it's the first explicit public stance for same-sex relationships that we took, and much activism followed that. One of the things we're really proud of is that a lot of bishops and priests would come to Dignity chapters and say, if you will renounce Dignity's statement of position and purpose, you can stay in this space. And not a single chapter took up that offer. So, and it was a tough decision for a lot of chapters because it was not an easy thing to be kicked out of your home. And many people wanted to stay, and many people left the organization over those decisions. But it was a very powerful moment of deciding to live in truth that led to us being able to take a lot of the public stands that we have over time and to really be a liberated community. Lots more to get into, but...
Thank you so much, Marianne. Zachary.
Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on marching, keep on fighting, marching up the freedom land. I feel so out of place here, and yet I feel like I belong. You see, I was the one who kept the house while my mentors, Renee McCoy, Nancy Wilson, Archbishop Carl Bean, sometimes Elder Troy Perry, went out to do the fighting and the marching. I was the one in the shadows of these bright lights who shouted from the rooftops and cried in the wilderness, not the wilderness of trees and desert wastelands, but the wilderness of the hood, the wilderness of urban cities, the wilderness of city parks and restrooms. He was shouting, the Archbishop Carl Bean. His message, God is love, and love is for everyone. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let homophobia turn me around. I'm gonna keep on marching, keep on fighting, marching up the freedom land. He taught us to love ourselves, to love our sex, our sexuality. He said sex is only dirty when you put it in the gutter. A new and fresh message, one that was never uttered by a black preacher before. A message so comforting, so real and heartfelt, so to the bone. My job, I was clear, was to refuel that light, to be there for him, as he was for so many. I was to do the funerals he could not do because he had just done 5 in a row each weekend. I was to do the parades and the marches that he simply was too broken or was too grief-stricken to do. That was my job. And I was clear that he, the Archbishop Carl Bean, was the sun and I was the moon. Then came Minority AIDS Project. Then came Dignity House, a home for people who had nowhere to live in the city of Los Angeles as they were dying. Then came the denomination, the Unity Fellowship Church movement. I was clear that my hour had not come. I was also clear that it was to come, and it is now here, right now. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on marching, keep on fighting, marching up the freedom land. I do have a story, one from the shadows. For in 1987, as I buried my lover and finding a community to grieve in and with, I was able to find my voice. Yeah. I, like Lazarus in the biblical story, was wrapped in my own grave clothes of shame and sometimes confusion. I had to realize that I had come from a long line of freedom fighters whose internal compass magnetically pointed towards freedom and liberation. I had to realize that there was fire shut up in my bones, an unquenchable thirst for fairness and justice for all. I had to come to an understanding that my patriotism could not be defined by any outside force, but it had to be defined from within. I am a justice patriot. My patriotism is like a nightmare disguised in a daydream. You don't want none of this. For I can hear the cries of all the black boys and men who were raped by white hands because of their sexuality, because of their obvious femininity, because of their refusal to submit. I can still hear the brokenhearted. They are all still among us. Shh, and you will hear them. I can hear the cries of my transgender brothers and sisters who are still waiting for their liberation and to hear their voices amongst our streets and find their places within our movement. And we will continue to hold that space for the Carls, for the Troys, for the Renees, for whenever and wherever they like to come in and come out, they may. Meanwhile, I ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on fighting, keep on marching, marching up the freedom land. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Well, not to be undone. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.
Yes.
That was one of the first songs that I learned while I was nurtured in the bosom of the Ebenezer Evangelical and Reformed Church in West Seneca, New York. Now the Ebenezer United Church of Christ, I believe. I was raised in a family that loved me, a community that surrounded me and supported me. I lived in a part of New York State that was rural and white, and it seemed like heaven because it was where I grew up. And then when I turned 10 years old, what seemed like an idyllic existence came to an end as I came to the realization for myself that what I really wanted was to grow up, to be a woman. In case you don't know, I was born male. You weren't there. When I was 10 years old in the suburbs of Atlanta now, believing that my life had somehow, because this was 1956, so we're going back a couple of decades, and I felt like I was broken and there was no place for me, except that we were now attending the Mount Vernon Presbyterian Church just down the street, a place where I continued to be reminded that God knew who I was through and through. And God loves me through and through. Talk about a setup for privilege. Oh my God. And so I made my way through high school believing that somehow I had made an error in judgment and this feeling inside of me was somehow wrong and would be turned around in some way. Maybe when I fell in love, my partner would sort of take that away from me and turn me into a man. And so I fell in love. I fell so in love it was not funny. I mean, that was 50 years ago, and I'm still in love with that same woman. And I thought she had cured me, and then she had not. I realized that my gender struggle would be something that I would have to live with as a secret for the rest of my life. So I built a life around the privilege that I had as now a white Presbyterian minister with counseling credentials on Peachtree Street in Atlanta, Georgia. What better place can one be than there? I mean, I was earning money. I was invited to preach in local churches. I served as an interim supply pastor, and life was good. Except in the meantime, our second daughter was born. She was 2.5 months premature. She struggled for life for the first 3 months. Her mom and I stood next to her incubator. It was this fancy space-age looking thing, and watched her as she struggled for life. And we vowed with each other that if Laura decided that she had had enough of life, that it was too hard, and she needed to let go and rest in the arms of eternity, that we would let her go. And likewise, if she decided to live, if she decided to stay with us, no matter where she took us, we would be there for her. We would be nurturing her. My life of white privilege came to a crashing end because I was now the father of a child who was severely disabled. You don't do that if you're a Presbyterian minister. You just don't do that. And so I left the church that I was in and moved to Atlanta with the family, and we survived. I got a degree in counseling, set up a practice, made lots of money. Life seemed good. I was successful. And by my mid-40s, I was suffering with a depression that had started in my teenage years and continued to grow in spite of the antidepressants and the psychiatrists that I saw over all those years. And I suddenly realized that I could not go on. It was a real complicated story. It's one of those things you don't realize easily. It had to do with some pills and traveling to Baltimore, and it had to do with late night talks with my wife, telling her that I had decided that I needed to change my gender. And you know what? I was lucky again. She surrounded me with love, said that she didn't know that she could be married to me, but she would be there for me. Our kids loved me. Life was great. Life was wonderful. Except for one thing. I had to deal with the church. You see, as a transgender minister, we hadn't been around. you guys had been marching and preaching and teaching for decades. And nobody ever thought that there would be someone like me in the church. And so I had a decision to make, because before now, most of people like me they had demitted the ministry. They had left. They had been defrocked. They had gone away. They disappeared. And because my life insurance, my health insurance, was tied to my ordination, I couldn't do that. See, I had a daughter who was fragile and needed medical care. And I couldn't let my gender transition interfere with her health and her well-being. And so I went to the church and screwed up my courage and asked them to please change my name on the rolls from Eric to Aaron, my middle name Carl to Katrina, and they wondered why, and I said I was thinking of changing my gender to something a little more feminine. And they said, we'll get back to you. And they did, and it started a process that lasted almost 2 years. The end of which I was standing on a dais pretty much like this, alone, with a lectern. And I was standing there in what had been, for me, a nightmare for my whole life. I was standing in front of 500 people, and I was wearing a really cute green jumper with an ivory blouse and heels, there to answer questions and to help them try to understand how I had gotten there. It was with the help of an old transsexual woman who met me in a greasy spoon and taught me that Jesus intended for me to do this, not for insurance purposes, but because there were people out there that were waiting, that they needed the sanctuary of church. And she led me to that lectern and made me speak. And the presbytery voted, it was 186 to 161 on October the 22nd, 1996. The first Protestant minister to change sex retained her ordination and continued work. You'll see us around in the group. I was the only one back then, and boy, have we grown. We have still much to do. Thank you for your words, because I think, transgender. I'm still the only ordained Presbyterian PCUSA minister after 21 years, and so when you see us, hire us. Ask us to come preach and teach. We're ready. But one of the things that I do believe deep in my heart is that none of that would have happened if the world had not been made safe by our lesbian, gay, and bisexual siblings who made the world safe for us to be here. We're still fighting, obviously. We've got some more fights to take care of. And we know you guys are going to be there with us, in it with us. Because, when you really get right down to it, gender is something that all of us have to do.
Thank you so much, Aaron. Thank you to all of our panelists for sharing these stories. We'll move into a question and answer portion among the panelists, and then we'll open it outward to the audience. You've laid so much out for us to talk about, so many different places that we can go, and in planning for this panel, we were overcome with all the different topics of the 1980s and the 1990s that we needed to touch upon, and we've already surfaced so many of them here. I wanted to start by thinking about the importance of the AIDS crisis in particular, and the way that it brought up issues of sexuality, of gender, of race, of inequality. And I wanted to think about the role of Unity Fellowship in that. And I wondered if, Zachary, you might share a little bit about how you came to Unity Fellowship and the kind of work that Unity has been involved with the AIDS crisis.
Okay. Thank you for that question. I came to Unity about 3 to 5 years after the Archbishop had founded it in the urban streets of Los Angeles at a old theater called the Ebony Showcase Theater, which was once a very popular theater in Los Angeles. And we were a small group there. My partner had died from the virus, and I literally had nowhere to turn. I met a guy subsequent of that event and was very interested in dating him, possibly. And he presented to me one condition: you've got to come go to church with me. And I thought to myself, oh my God, I've been to seminary, and I lived a life that once I came out in so-called straight church, they wanted me to keep it amongst the clergy and not spread it. It was okay as long as only a few people knew about it. And so I decided there's no way I can live like that. They were loving and supportive as much as they could be, but what they were presenting to me was ridiculous. And so this gentleman that had invited me, I said, okay, I'll go to church with you. And went to the Ebony Showcase, and the rest is really history. I was amazed when I walked in the door, not so much at the ambiance of the place or it was a rundown shack. There were birds flying through the ceiling, but when the Archbishop came out and began to preach, it was like water to a dry, thirsty, parched land. It just fed my soul. And excerpts of those sermons I mentioned prior, God is love and love is for everyone. And that phrase has been the foundation of our work. And we have, just with that as our slogan, have drawn hundreds and hundreds of people to that work because it was a message of embrace and acceptance that revolutionized, I think, the Black church movement, period.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
This was also a period, of course, with the rise of the religious right and a lot of discussion in the media about the rise of the right. And in this moment, much of the LGBT community became isolated from religion. So you've all talked a little bit about what it is to be doing this work in a community that, on the one hand, many parts of which are hostile to religion, at the same time that you're working within religion. What does it mean to have a collar? I wonder if you might speak to what that was like in your own lives, what it was like to sort of play this mediating role.
Yes, I think just to think about, as the moral majority was growing, you had the U.S. National Council of Churches, which represent a lot of the denominations that are in this room, and they were attacked on 60 Minutes, they and the World Council of Churches, and labeled communist. This is during the Reagan era. And it was really, in some sense, the beginning of the end, especially around the National Council of Churches, because they responded with fear and, in some sense, withdrawing. So the last thing they wanted to deal with was Metropolitan Community Church making an application for membership to the National Council, which from our point of view, as we looked at the religious landscape and the growth of the religious right, in one sense, we looked to the National Council, which had a history of working on civil rights and other issues, that could be, in some sense, a natural ally. They had already passed a pro-LGBT statement, at least they had done that already. But of course, quite quickly, after all this drama, they reacted in fear. The membership committee of the National Council of Churches, in this whole other story, voted unanimously that we were actually eligible for membership. We met all the criteria, which threw them into major homosexual panic in the National Council of Churches, which of course included a lot of people who were themselves gay or lesbian who worked for the National Council, incredible, gifted, wonderful people who were our allies. But the constituent churches and the leadership of the denominations now were very, in some sense, are withdrawing, pulling back from this, what had been a very strong voice and prestigious voice, which it certainly is not today. And when they turned down our membership by saying they decided not to decide, we went into a series of things you'll be familiar with, of dialogues for several years. The first dialogue was on scripture and homosexuality, and this is so telling, because we had a committee comprised of MCC people and National Council of Churches, including Orthodox and Protestant and all that, and we met together to formulate how would we have a dialogue on scripture and homosexuality. So we thought simply we'd have scholars on both sides of the issue. That seemed like the thing to do. And so we had the scripture scholars that we thought were supporting our point of view. And then we said, well, you know, who would be the other scholars that would be on the other side? And there was silence from the National Council of Churches people. And so we said, well, we know some names. So we presented them with the names of people we believed who were writing, and they said, we don't respect any of those people. Now, I thought that should be front page news. That the U.S. in 1986, 31 years ago, the National Council of Churches leadership basically said, we respect the scripture scholars that are teaching your point of view, and we don't respect the others. We had our dialogue. It was all with people who are our point of view. Then people said it was biased, when we held it. But it exposed that the church knew, but they wouldn't teach it, and they wouldn't promote it. This was not an issue in which they could say, oh, we really didn't know. They did know. In 1986, they knew. And so that, we had 11 years of a very dysfunctional relationship with the National Council of Churches, some incredible experiences together, I think ways in which we touched a lot of hearts and lives, and but that had a disappointing ending that is also part of the decline of mainstream churches in the United States, and so it's connected somehow. Yeah.
I think the issue of how Catholics and fundamental evangelicals kind of came together is also very much rooted in sort of the whole question of AIDS, as well as, of course, in misogyny and those sorts of things. I mean, I think the whole issue of HIV and AIDS in the Catholic community was incredibly conflicted. You had, some hospitals, some parishes, some Catholic institutions who were doing just amazing work in terms of caring for people with AIDS and providing services for families and for folks who were sick. And then you had hospitals that didn't know how to handle folks and, who did a lot of sort of extreme precautions and, just were isolating people and demeaning people and making folks feel terrible. You had places that refused to bury people who had died of AIDS. You had, you just had all kinds of craziness going on within the institution, except at the hierarchical level, where the policy arm of the church, the bishops were all about, it kind of got linked with abortion and reproductive rights and, the no condoms available, and we're not going to teach safer sex, and we can't look at this as a health crisis, it's a moral issue, and all of that sort of things, leading to this connection that grew up with a lot of the fundamentalist folks that turned into anti-marriage equality and now turns into export of hate, to Africa and South America, and all of these things kind of connect with each other. And at the same time, we were seeing Catholic families who were learning that their kids, mostly their sons, were gay, sick, and dying. and trying to take all of that in the context of their faith, in a way that absolutely transformed families and made our movement visible, made us visible beyond our own community in a way that I think led to, lots of different kinds of activisms. The Catholics were definitely very visible in, all of the protests against Bush and, trying to get medicines released and more funding and all of that. But we also took it into the church, which I think we had never really done so visibly before. I mean, our New York folks, the protests that happened in St. Patrick's, week after week after week, of people standing and turning their backs, as Cardinal O'Connor spoke, and never mentioned all of the people in New York who were dying, and all of the people who were suffering, and the people of all races who were suffering, and who were being served by members of the church who were sitting there. And, I think that was a really important moment for us to think about, that our activism had to happen both in the civil sphere and in the ecclesial sphere, and that was happening in those regions was so connected. And I think that has impacted us through the 90s, through today, and just keeps on going.
I wish that, from the transgender community standpoint, we could say that the religious right was a thing of the past. Unfortunately, it's not something that we look back on. I think transgender experience is kind of the ultimate secret weapon of the religious right, because what they've been doing with you guys is telling people that, if you don't cut it out, we're going to be confused about boys and girls and who is who, and transgender experience sort of illustrates their point. That makes us sort of ripe for what we're now worried about is being able to pee, which is kind of a basic human right. Thank you for the all-gender bathrooms.
Aaron, just to follow up a bit, as we were talking before, you talked about the importance of the mid-1990s and of the internet especially, for what that meant within your own experience. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what it meant to have this moment, especially in 1996, and I wonder if you might speak a little bit about what it means to live as a trans person in our current national moment, and the differences between what was afforded in the 1990s and now.
Okay, it's hard to believe the 1990s were 21 years ago. It's amazing. For me, of course, it was, I went from needing practically to keep my ordination for a practical reason, believing that, and honestly believing that my ordination, I was ordained in 1973, which was a really long time ago, and I had gotten to the place in my work and in my theology to understand that being ordained was not going to save me. It didn't make me special. It had done nothing for me in my life except give me a lot of work to do. And so, I was ready to let go of it until that my story unfortunately became big. These days, people can change sex, change gender, and it's, you call up the newspaper and say, I have a story for you, and they say, so what? People are doing it all over town. For me, it was different because it was a minister. It came up in the context of a presbytery meeting where there was conflict, and it sort of represented, I think, the conflict in our culture at a level that made it difficult for the church to sort of deal with it in the casual way because I wanted them to change my name and just let me go on about my business. That's what I wanted. I did not want to be an activist of any kind. And, as soon as the first newspaper article came out, it was big, and it was, it had huge headlines. Seeking Acceptance was the title of the story, and it was, it was all about my fight with the church and how shocked the elders were at my request, and how dismayed people were that we were now letting ministers do things like this. And this old woman called me up about 2 weeks after the first story hit. I call her Ida because I don't remember what her name really is, but her name was Ida, and she called me up and explained to me. Old people had been calling me since the newspaper article came out to tell me that I needed to get right with God, and that if I only let Jesus, Jesus would heal me, and I'm sure you all have heard those things before. Jesus, if I only had enough faith in Jesus and prayed the right way, like the 23 years that I had been screaming at God about myself didn't count. And all the psychiatry visits I had done didn't count. And so I was ready for this old lady to scream at me again over the phone, and I braced myself. And she said, Aaron, did you in your treatment by any chance meet John Money? And I said, well, in fact, John had not helped me with my transition, but he did help me. I didn't get to see him as a professional, but I did call him up and talk with him, and he helped me. And he referred me to another therapist there in Baltimore, and she said, you could hear her voice brighten over the telephone. She said, oh, good. She said, John Money is my doctor too. And I said, oh, okay. She said, I was one of the first people to go through the gender clinic at Johns Hopkins back in the 1970s, and she told me about her life. She had moved back to Atlanta after her transition. She had gotten married to a man, which of course is what you were supposed to do. She was this short little thing. She wasn't no more than 5'2". She was tiny, and she'd been married for quite a few years. Her husband had never known that she was not born female. That's the old model. That's the model of the 50s and the 60s and 70s and into the 80s. So her husband didn't even really know who she really was. But she said they had a good marriage. He had died. She retired into a retirement community there on Ponce de Leon. And she was attending the big Presbyterian church next door. And she told me about her going to this church it was like her whole life right now, because she didn't have a husband anymore. She spent her days in the church mostly playing music. She was a pianist, and this church was the center of her life. And so, I learned how to do things from Janie Sparr and Michael Adie. And so I put my hands out and I reached across the thing and I grabbed both of her hands and I said, how wonderful to meet a fellow transgender Presbyterian. And her face turned dark. And she said, oh, but I'm not a Presbyterian. And so I said, why? I don't. You just told me that this church was the center of you. You love this church. Why are you not a Presbyterian? She said, I didn't think that I was supposed to join the church. Because of who I am, that God wouldn't want me to be a member of the church. She said, that's why when I saw an article in the paper about a Presbyterian minister who was like me, I just had to meet you. Jesus was meeting me at the Majestic in Atlanta, and Jesus was an old transsexual woman. Amen.
We have almost 30 minutes left for questions from the audience. I hope our panelists will take some questions. If you have a question, please just raise your hand and I'll try to run to you. Oh, there's another mic in the back.
We must have covered it really well.
So, Aaron, I've been wondering if you've ever spoken at the ITC in Atlanta, Georgia?
I guess I've never really spoken there in terms of having an invitation from ITC. One of my good friends and, well, she's more than a good friend, Margaret Amer, was a Bible professor there, and she would invite me to come into her Bible classes to help her with Greek New Testament theology. And Margaret was something of a, Margaret now, I guess, teaches at Austin Theological Seminary in Austin, Texas. That was about as close as I got, was Margaret's absolutely fabulous Greek classes. They were amazing. She's an amazing Greek teacher. So.
I was thinking that I saw you at the ITC at some point while I was
You might have. I've attended several things there. I was on a panel there.
That's it. That's it.
It was quite some time ago.
This would have been in the late 90s.
That's right.
And so
Right.
life is strange because
Yeah.
I remember you, and I was working through my own sexual identity.
Oh, bless
And so
your
I
heart.
get the opportunity today to thank you for speaking at the ITC, which at the time, though the bastion of Black liberation theology, had some very homophobic ways.
Yeah.
And I sat in the audience and listened to you and was blessed by your presence. So I thank you for having the courage to come and be on that panel, because you took some tough questions that day. And I appreciate
well,
your
you know,
presence.
you might imagine I did. I took a lot of tough questions.
Thank you, Pamela. Other questions? If you could say your name.
My name is Beverly Reddick, and one of the things that I struggled with during this time was how we as people were used to fill the coffers for the moral majority. Every time they needed money, they sent out another letter. And I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that, but they've gotten rich off of us.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to that if I can. One of the things in terms of the African American experiences and the evangelicals, particularly with them having power over the TV waves, if you took black dollars, little old ladies who sent their money in, I think, in fact, I know the Crouches, particularly Jan's hairdo, would probably not be what it was. They literally would target the African American community in large ways. And you're absolutely right. They did. Anytime they wanted to up the dollars, or they would get an Evie Hill or someone like that who they knew was extremely homophobic, and they would use that and then collect millions of dollars from little old black women and men who were at home in front of their televisions. So you're absolutely right, yes.
Thank you all for your witness and your decades of faithfulness and work. I'd like to just hear from each of you briefly, because you have been in this work for so long. What one thing have you learned that you had to hold on to do it, and what have you learned that you had to let go of for your work?
Thank you, Nathan. I think always to hold on to was the purpose of what we were doing, which, you know, we never wanted the approval of the National Council of Churches. We wanted to confront them that they were not complete without us, that the church as a whole is not complete without us. And I think it was the faces and the realities of the people's lives who found us, who we found, and to see the transformation in people's lives, that they could have wholeness and joy and hope. That's the fuel. And that's what you hold on to, because other kinds of success is, you know, comes and goes and is never guaranteed. And I think the thing to let go of is the, well, maybe it's the same side of the thing, is the approval. You know, first it was the approval of my parents when I was very young, or the church I came out of, the United Methodist Church, or in so many other ways, you know, that, and letting go of results, that I really simply had to persevere, and, you know, that through success and through failure sometimes failure is a great teacher. It's you know, not the most welcome one, but it is an important teacher. But to really say, how am I serving the God of my understanding in this moment, and that's enough.
I think I'm going to start with what we had to let go, or what I had to let go of. I'm not going to speak for the whole movement here, so Dignity folks, calm down. You know, I think early on in Dignity's history, we believed that changing the church and getting acceptance was in the foreseeable future. You know, much like early Christian communities expected that second coming very, very quickly. And I think that, you know, particularly the callousness and evil that the church hierarchy did around the issue of HIV/AIDS and putting dogma above the lives of so many all over the globe, said to me that this institution, it taught me at a level I never knew before how much this institution was about preserving itself and not about the ministry in some ways, that it says how far it's separated from the gospel. I'll say it that way. What that meant they had to learn to move towards was that our responsibility was to take care of those whom the institution had discarded in every way, shape, and form that we possibly could. To do that without apology, without worrying about whose feathers we were going to ruffle, and to root ourselves in the concept of church as community, you know, and not about the buildings, not about the structure, not about the Catholic ink, as I call it, and to really figure out how to live that, which is an incredible challenge for folks who are raised in that institutional structure.
That question is a preacher's question, because it makes me want to hoop and rear back on that one, because I had to hold on to my faith. I had to hold on that I knew that I knew that I knew that I knew that I was loved by God no matter what. I had to hold on to the fact that when I ran out of those classrooms at 6, 7, 8, 9 years old because they were calling me sissy, and I ran to the yard and I would be out there crying and weeping, I would hear and feel the comfort of the Holy Ghost right out there on that yard. God would show up and give me the comfort that I need. And when I grew up and then was involved in this work, I had to reflect back on those times in the still small voice of comfort that somehow would resonate in my soul. And I had to hold on to that, and I continue to hold on to that to this very hour. I had to let go of beautiful spirits and people that I was confused with that same God. How could you possibly take these souls away from me? I had to not take it so personal in a way that would free me and liberate me. I would have conversations with myself. You've got to do better than this. You've got to do these funerals. You've got to be present. You've got to show up. And so you're going to have to find a way to deal with death and dying. And I had to begin with my own death. And I had to die again and again and again. And I had to keep dying until I was no longer afraid of death. I had to deal with my own HIV and my own AIDS. And whatever fear lurked behind those words, I had to confront. And I believe that I'm there. I believe it.
I'm getting a crick in my neck. I heard that as a personal question, and to me, it was letting, I had to let go of my sense of privileged blessedness. I felt for a long time like, I would make statements about how God had blessed my life with all the wonderful things that I had. And then I didn't have them, and what I gained was learning that I didn't have those things. I didn't have privilege. That was the blessing that I found in my life, because I found that I belonged. I had a community. I was alone before, and I had to let go of my pride and learn to let other people carry me when I needed to be carried, and let them encourage me when I needed to be encouraged, and not rely on myself for all of those things just by myself. Man, you can preach. Ooh.
So my name is Reverend Deborah Johnson from Santa Cruz. And I want to say thank you, first off, to everybody, on the panel. I was deeply moved by all of your stories. And I'm particularly pleased, Reverend Nancy, that you acknowledged the fact that the LGBT movement, from a legal standpoint, rides on the back of the civil rights movement and a lot of other movements that went before it. I think it's really, really important, and that we also pay back into that infrastructure some. Which leads me to just a comment that I want to make in regards to the question about the radical right coming up in the 80s and the 90s, and to tie it to something that you said, Zachary, that there was a real coup that's happened, and the LGBT community got bamboozled. And they got bamboozled into this notion of the black community being homophobic and anti-gay, when historically speaking, there's nothing further from the truth.
Absolutely.
That the Congressional Black Caucus has always been in support of the LGBT movement. Coretta Scott King herself was with us in the NAACP at Stonewall 25. I can go on and on. It was Jesse Jackson back in 1980 who was the first presidential candidate to put LGBT issues forward. And that's where we got the whole rainbow thing from. Before that, we were just lavender everything. And he had the Rainbow Coalition. And he says, no, you're not just a color. You're part of the whole big rainbow. And we just took over the whole rainbow and forgot the fact that we were just being put in the rainbow as part of a larger, coalition. Somebody mentioned last night about Willie Brown being the one to change the sodomy laws in the state of California. He's an African-American man. I mean, I can go on and on. Sylvia Rue is somewhere in the room here, and she did a beautiful, beautiful film called God and Gaze. I'm not God and Gaze, that's another movie he was in. All God's Children. Yeah, All God's Children, and Bishop Carl Beam, was in that as well. And it is the ignoring of this history that has prevented us from doing the coalition building that we should do, and quite frankly has pissed off a lot of our allies who stuck their necks way out there for us at times, and we have turned on them. And I'm really glad to see, I am so glad to see that this movement now, this LGBT movement, starting to give back some and starting to stand with some of the other movements that have stood with us for such a long time.
Beautiful.
Hello, my name is Ray Bagnuolo from Sayville, New York, and a sign of my recovery, my friends tell me, is when I stop arguing with people that aren't there. So I'm getting better at doing that, walking around. But there are still times, when the honesty about what we need to do sometimes gets coupled up with the anger at what it is we're not getting done. And we look at our lives and our participation in the movement from the perspective we have, from the associations we share, from the faith, the belief that we bring with us. And so my question to you is, because I'm always searching, it's a personal question, perhaps for others as well. What do you say when you're talking to people that aren't there about what needs to be done? And if not that, what is the charge, if you have one, from your perspective for what we need to do now?
You need to invite transgender people to come and preach in your church. You need for them to have leadership positions. We desperately need people who are not transgender to become outspoken allies to speak for us, because whenever we speak for ourselves, people say, well, you're just being self-serving. Yeah, well, of course. When an ally speaks and speaks powerfully in favor of transgender people and our needs for we can be fired from jobs for no cause. We can be denied housing. It's sort of a nightmare. It's kind of like the nightmare that the black community went through, and maybe still is, with housing. We can be kicked out of our apartments and our communities simply because we're transgender, and we need help with that. So I think one of the things that I'm looking to is for the transgender community to sort of take its place along the LGB continuum and become a true partner with LG and B and all the other letters of the alphabet, so that we can move on from this place. Because right now, one of the things I have to say is trans experience is not widely accepted anywhere, and that includes spaces like this. It's pretty much probably accepted that if you're lesbian or gay, this is home and you can be free to be here and relax into yourself. But I know that there are people who are sitting here with us who struggle mightily with transgender issues and don't know how to address it. To those people, I say, open your mouth, start talking. What happened for me was for 40 years, I kept my mouth shut, and I was dying with my own self-hatred. It was only after I could open my mouth and accept myself that I was able to move forward. And so, you know, if you struggle with transgender experience at any place, this is the place to talk about it, not the bathroom.
I would just say this is the most critical time since I think I've been alive that we have to be totally awake, and that we cannot afford to be in, you know, little boxes of our causes, that we have to be activists like we've never been before in our lives, and that it's time for us to take our place in all the movements that right now need us, and to put our energies in those movements and be out in them and unashamed.
That's good.
And to realize we can't afford to be pitted against each other in that way. We're going to. Black Lives Matter has to be our cause. Immigration has to be our cause. That health care has to be our cause. All of these things are connected. Sexual assault, the needs of children in our world and our community, and the fact that we do live, this is a global age, and everything we do here, whether it's about climate change or anything else, impacts people all over the globe all the time, and we have to take responsibility for it, and we have to claim our place in the body politic and say that we're going to be a force, and we're not going to be pushed back into any closets.
That's right. That's right.
We're coming towards the end of our time, but can I just have a sense of how many people have questions? Maybe if we could get the questions out, if you could just spend maybe a minute and give your question or your comment, and then that'll give each of our panelists about a minute to respond and to close as they see fit. Who else has a question? Just raise your hand.
Well, first of all, I feel like I'm about to go from the sublime to the trivial in asking this question, but I'm going to ask anyway, because it's been my observation that there's been an evolution, particularly in the MCC, in the way theology is done. And at least based on my failed experience of trying to be a part of MCC in the 80s. And now, though I'm not really a part of any church group, I feel like if I were going to do it, I might well be in the MCC. And I'm wondering, Nancy, whether that perception of mine lines up with yours, and if so, whether you could speak to it a bit.
Yes, I think just to say, as MCC grew and included more and more diverse people and points of view, I think we struggled. At first, you know, our theology was very determined by, you know, we were founded by a Pentecostal evangelical, some things that were at first kind of uncritical, and we all grew and learned. We shifted and changed, and our own experience pushed us, I think, to become more progressive. At the same time, we always felt like we had our roots and connections in the evangelical movement, and which is an important thing, is we have to talk to each other and we have to impact each other. So I think there's a lot of freedom in MCC. At the same time, you know, it takes a lot of patience sometimes to be in a community where there's so much theological diversity and things to be worked out all the time. And I encourage you, if you haven't seen it, we have a brand new statement of faith after almost 50 years that we finally put together ourselves. Our first statement of faith was just kind of something for everybody else, but this is ours, and it's in the exhibit hall. And I feel like it's a much more open-hearted and progressive and future-focused. So I hope, thank you for that and for that invitation. And that's it. Blessings.
And this is not MCC specific, but I think it is very critical that we all realize that the structures of faith are changing. in the queer world and in every other place. The lines are blurring. People are spiritually hungry. They're hungry for community, but faith is happening in the streets. It's happening around dinner tables. It's happening in colleges. It's happening in bars. It's happening in lots of other places. And I think if we don't get better at reading the signs of the times, responding to the signs of the times, and being leaders in those movements, it's not going to look good for us. I think we have a real responsibility to break out of the norms and hear where the voices of now are calling us.
Beautiful.
So I want to ask you the same question that I asked the panel this morning, namely to contextualize your stories and experiences. And both in relation to the panel this morning, how much did you know of their experience, their work, and what happened when you were growing up, and how much did that shape your experiences, and how much did you know of one another's work and what was happening in other denominations?
Maybe if you could each respond in about a minute or so.
Okay. I've been working in queer faith work for a long time now, and really valued opportunities to do intersectional work across denominations. And I think we were actually pretty good at doing that in the 90s and early 2000s. And, there were spaces for us to come together, faith leaders to come together, to learn from each other, to see, what's happening in your denomination, what are your issues, what are the structures you're up against, what are your approaches. And those spaces have kind of fallen apart at this point. And one of the things that I hope will come out of this conference is more intentionality around doing that work, because I think it's vitally important that we be connected and learn from one another and correct each other on our errors.
For Unity, we always had a very powerful relationship with the MCC Church. Our founders, both Troy and Carl, are very good friends, personal friends. And Carl came from the MCC Church. His ordination papers are with the MCC Church. So that relationships and having both of those powerful prophets in the same city gave me then, as I was growing into this, an opportunity to visit Troy's house and hear them talk about a range of conversations and having dinner with them and being at their feet, so to speak, helped tremendously. Our relationship from church to church, there were times I would substitute for Nancy when she had to be on the field fighting. I would go and substitute as a young minister, and Pat Baumgartner and I are very good friends to this very day. And we share an interfaith Martin Luther King celebration that we've done for years. And so we've been intentional about forging many of those relationships. Dignity and Unity certainly have been honorable friends down through the years. So by the 80s, I don't know much before then, but certainly around the early 80s, there was an intentional attempt to broaden this idea of community.
I would say Dan Smith is here from West Hollywood, and Dan Smith and Rabbi Egger and I in Los Angeles, we used to meet for lunch and complain about our boards, and then we started from that. We started the Lesbian and Gay Interfaith Clergy Organization, which ended up having like 50 people in it eventually, but kind of ruined our lunches, but it was a great thing. So I think I think we do interfaith thing really interestingly and ecumenical work. And there was kind of a golden time around after the time HRC and several other organizations took a beating in the elections. They had faith, really supported faith organizations, and we did a lot of incredible stuff together that was so collaborative, and I do miss that right now, and I feel like there's a vacuum and it needs to be filled because I miss the kind of incredible collaboration that we did.
And don't forget us in that. I really think that the transgender community has been, we've been focused so much on establishing our places within the organizations and denominations that we haven't paid very much attention to intersectionalities with other groups. I think that that's something that we definitely need to be included in as it happens.
Please join me in thanking our panelists.